All right, endocrine system part two. Now, just remember, guys, you do have a quiz, okay? Now, it has to be completed by midnight on Friday, all right? And if there's issues with Respondus browser, all that fun jazz, I just need some type of confirmation or it's not considered an excused absence, okay? So, where we stopped last time was parathyroid glands. All right, so this is probably the second one you hear most about when you hear of endocrine system. Okay, so this guy, again, they're all really small. So it's small glands that are embedded in the posterior surface of the thyroid gland, hence the name parathyroid. Now, there's usually four total, one superior and one inferior, and on each thyroid lobe. All right, and then it's about 40 milligrams per size for each of those. And its main function is to really regulate blood calcium levels. It doesn't so much mess with metabolism. That's usually a more so on the thyroid job, not so much the parathyroid. But looking into the histological side of things, these guys have two main epithelial cell types: dense principal, also known as chief cells, Pell principle, also known as oxidable cells. Okay, dense principal cells, those are the most abundant, so the most that are there, and they secrete parathyroid hormone, also known as PTH. Now, the other, pale principal cells, they really don't know what the function is. Okay, that's pretty unclear. They haven't really figured it out in normal glands, but it's really useful for more of a histological identification of which portion of this is the parathyroid, are the other ones dense principle. So it's really useful for that. However, the function, not so much known. But what they do know is more of a disease side of things. It does actually have the capability to secrete excess PTH. Now, this is most common in parathyroid cancer, but they've seen in some other cancers. Obviously, as we'll see, this goes and starts to mess with calcium levels in the blood, which can itself lead to pretty dramatic changes. This is just a histological example of where it's at, right? So if you're looking at the thyroid gland, you have your parathyroids, like I said, quite tiny. Again, you have your left superior and inferior, and your right superior and right inferior parathyroid. Okay, so they are within and associated with the thyroid. There's two on each side, one superior, one inferior. And when again you look inside, down more on the histological side, we see the difference of our dense principal parathyroid cells, much more darker, much more, as you could say, like a defined epithelial type cells. However, your pale principal parathyroid cell, they're less dense in the nucleus. They're more, you could say, like open, and the surrounding cells less densely packed. So that's why they're pretty obvious when you're looking at it in a histological side. So it's really useful when you're kind of telling what's what and where's where. So the parathyroid hormone, like I said, it's basically what the parathyroid secretes. Okay, and then it's primarily there to regulate blood calcium. It also regulates magnesium and phosphate levels in the blood as well. Now, its overall effect, if it's secreted, is that it's going to increase calcium and magnesium, but it's also going to decrease blood phosphate. Okay, so you're starting to get where and why it does its job, because it needs to regulate, right? And so, besides just the overall effect, it has strict actions on systems or regions of the body. Now, of course, we have calcium and magnesium, mostly calcium, we start to see bone. All right, so because of this and its effect on calcium in the blood and its ability for calcium to spread throughout the system, it starts to impact, the number and activity osteoclasts, so the cells that lead to bone formation, bone healing, things like that. So as such, with that, it starts to impact, bone resorption, healing factors of the bone, and it releases calcium and phosphate itself into the blood. Now, kidneys, as we know, it's our little flush out. When this PTH is there, it starts to decrease urinary loss of the calcium and magnesium, because obviously we need calcium, we need magnesium in the body. It's why everybody right now is so obsessed with taking the magnesium supplements. All right, but it increases urinary loss of phosphate. Okay, so the net effect is calcium goes up, phosphate goes down. And in the process of this, it also stimulates basically an active vitamin D. All right, so it's, again, seems to be a common theme, right? Regulation of calcium. Now, intestines, what occurs is it actually creates a specific molecule, which we basically just talked about with the active vitamin D, but it also does it in the intestines. Now, this is in an indirect manner how it has an impact. Okay, so PTH is there, okay, into the kidneys. It then makes active vitamin D. Active vitamin D increases absorption of calcium, phosphate, and magnesium into the intestine. And in the process, where's the intestine going to go, right? In the process, though, it actually enhances availability of calcium for the blood, because our intestines are very highly vasculature, as well as, it's there to help with basically bringing what we consume through the system into our circulation. So it's allowing for the availability of calcium to get into the blood, as well as some secretion of others like phosphate. Regulation of these both. Okay, so all calcium, it's directly controlled by calcium levels, not so much controlled by the pituitary itself. Okay, you have low calcium, as we would expect, your PTH secretion goes up. All right, you get more bone resorption, you get renal calcium reabsorption, you get more increased activated vitamin D, which leads to intestinal calcium absorption. Whereas if I have high levels, it's the opposite. Okay, so it stimulates the active vitamin D release from thyroid C cells. All right, and in the process of doing that, it starts to inhibit the action and the function of osteoclasts, and it starts to promote calcium storage in bone. All right, so taking the calcium out of the circulation and starting to store it. And as with anything, negative feedback, PTH secretion is actually suppressed, which supports the ability to reduce the amount of active vitamin D. This is kind of just a way of showing. All right, so parathyroid hormone we'll start with on the right here. You have a stimulus, controlled condition, blood calcium levels, whether it's up, whether it's down. And what is monitored by is the parathyroid glands. It's monitored by the calcium, but it impacts the parathyroid glands by the stimulation occurring. And these dense principal parathyroid cells of the parathyroid glands, they release PTH. Okay, as they release PTH, it goes into circulation. It gets eventually to the kidneys. It gets eventually to the osteoclasts, and all about that just brings an increased blood calcium level. But it also leads to activated vitamin D or calcitonin. So now calcitonin on the left, again, blood calcium levels. It is actually monitored by the thyroid gland. All right, so you're seeing a difference here. Monitoring for this parathyroid hormone is done by parathyroid. However, calcitonin is by thyroid. All right, so what happens though is if it stimulates, it goes to the control center. So this time it's the C thyrocyte of the thyroid gland. All right, we've talked about these guys last time, and it releases more of the calcitonin. So calcitonin goes and it affects the osteoclasts, and it brings about decreased blood calcium levels. Okay, so parathyroid hormone is there to increase blood calcium levels. Okay, parathyroid gland is more of the monitoring side of things. Calcitonin is there to decrease blood calcium levels, and it's the thyroid gland that leads that guy by itself. All right. Okay, so next is adrenal gland. Okay, so this is a paired gland that's superior to each kidney. All right, retroperitoneal. Now, it's structure-wise, it's mostly cortex, so that is where your steroid hormones are going to come, and obviously these are extremely essential for our life, as well as the medulla. Okay, so the catecholamines, they're more of stress response, so that's about 10 to 20% of the size of the gland. Okay, and so as such, this is very highly vascular. All right, and it kind of makes sense because you need these certain things to get quicker to certain regions, right? Steroid hormones, like I said, essential for life. So it's prioritized that these get to where they need to be as quick as possible, and the stress response is kind of tied in with your fight or flight. So obviously we don't want to be sitting there waiting for ever hours for our hormones to say, hey, there's a bear coming, we should be scared, whereas it's able to get there quicker. All right, and the loss actually of those cortical hormones, all right, they can lead to fatal electrolyte imbalance without treatment. So that is why, it's so important. Just one example of why it's so essential. It needs to be there quicker. Again, just an example, or a little show of exactly what I'm talking about. We have our kidneys. Like I said, there's two. All right, if you're looking at your body straight on, top of the kidneys. Okay, and as such you have left and right. Okay, so here we are on the glands. Okay, now the cortex is broken up into three zones. All right, the first one is zona glomerulosa. These are more mineral corticoids when it comes to hormones. So the most common one that comes out of it is aldosterone. It helps to regulate a lot of our electrolytes, so our potassium, our hydrogens, our sodiums, as well as really interacting with blood volume and blood pressure. Its strongest effect is on our kidney. All right, so it helps with water retention by increasing our sodium reabsorption into the kidney, into the blood. It helps with regulating potassium and hydrogen secretion or levels within our blood. This is all, as you can start to see, kind of like a regulation of electrolytes as well as these ions, which will lead to a change in pH. All right. Obviously, we don't want to have too much of a fluctuation in our pH within our veins. Right? Doesn't sound like a good time. So as this is obviously really crucial for a crucial balance for several reasons, it has its own control system. All right, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or RAA. Now, this system is triggered by blood volume, its pressure, its sodium content. If it's all low, if it's all decreased, it is triggered. Now, it's also stimulated by an increased level of blood potassium. All right. And it really doesn't have too much of an influence with ACTH. All right, it's very minimal influence. Now that RAA pathway, okay, so like I said, it's there to help regulate blood volume, the pressure, all the electrolytes, keeping those guys balanced, and it's all by that aldosterone secretion. All right, so we talked, triggers to stimuli your dehydration, right? Low levels of H2O, that leads to a decreased blood volume and can affect the blood pressure. If you have low electrolyte levels, such as low sodium levels, hemorrhage, okay? So these are all triggers. They all stimulate the pathway, okay? It can all mess with our blood volume decrease, which obviously correlates with a decrease in blood pressure. Now the pathway has a specific flow of events. For this, we're looking stimulus that's got low blood pressure. All right, it stimulates these specific cells, juxtaglomerular cells that are in the kidneys, and these cells release renin into bloodstream. Now renin converts angiotensinogen from the liver into angiotensin 1. Now, angiotensin converting enzyme, also known as ACE, which is mainly in our lung capillaries, it converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And it has two major effects. It stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. It causes vasoconstriction of arteries, which raises blood pressure. But it also can act on the kidneys once aldosterone is there. Okay, we already talked about it. Increased sodium reabsorption in kidneys, increased water reabsorption, osmosis, increases of potassium and hydrogen ion secretion into urine. And the real all result of this is that we've increased our blood volume. We've got our blood pressure increased, and we restored homeostasis, especially within electrolyte balance, or also hydration. This is just a quick depiction. All right, like I said, stimulus, dehydration, sodium, hemorrhage, all that fun, not fun stuff. Blood volume and blood pressure will change. Okay, now those kidney cells specifically, they have the receptors to detect the changes. They release renin, all right, and then that converts into angiotensinogen and into angiotensin 1. Now, angiotensin 1 finds its way to the control center, which is lungs. All right, so that's where ACE, the enzyme, converts the inactive angiotensin 1 into active angiotensin 2. Now, angiotensin 2 is the one that finds the cells of the cortex and allows it to release aldosterone. Okay, and that release of aldosterone is where the kidneys go. They're allowed to absorb water, return the balance of electrolytes, reduce the ion levels in our blood, as well as just returning our volume and pressure of blood. Just like anything, though, it has a negative feedback. All right, once all of that is changed, it's back to normal. We have our negative feedback inhibition, which leads to either a halt or slower exposure of this hormone. All right, so the next cortex, okay, is more so your glucocorticoids. All right, so this is like cortisol, which is the most major hormone. There's others, but cortisol is the most major, and which we'll kind of talk more about. And so they all have their functions. Each may be a little different, but overall they have functions for protein breakdown, gluconeogenesis, fat metabolism, your resistance to stress, any, anti-inflammatory immunosuppressive features, and increasing vascular sensitivity. Okay, so making amino acids to help with development of, say, muscles or growth, controlling your blood glucose, impacting your blood pressure. So all super important things, but once again, like I said, everything's got a pathway. And the control for this one is the hypothalamus anterior pituitary cortex. Okay, that is how the control mechanism occurs. And it's regulated by a negative feedback, just as everything is. Like I said, this is the most common. All right, positive feedback is super rare. And as usual, the endpoint hormones, such as cortisol, goes forth and it inhibits these hormones that lead to cortisol production or secretion. So it can go back to the hypothalamus, inhibit the hormone there, go back to the anterior pituitary, limit the hormone there, which then altogether just stops or negates this cortisol suppression or oppression. All right, so glucocorticoids. All right, these are steroid hormones, and they're secreted by this specific region of the adrenal cortex. And like I said, there's three main ones. We got cortisol, corticosterone, cortisone. All right, now cortisol is the most abundant. It's not, but 95% of these guys have the full activity of the glucocorticoids. All right, and like I had said, a lot of it comes from changes in blood pressure, changes within the metabolism and stress response. So really with regulation of metabolism, because it impacts things like glucose, fat regulation, and proteins, it's all impacting the availability of energy substrates. For instance, protein breakdown, that is increasing the proteolysis in skeletal muscle. So like I had said, your protein breakdown of skeletal muscle, which leads to an release in amino acids that increases its level in bloodstream, which can allow to get to other organs or cells, which they need amino acids to generate proteins. Gluconeogenesis. All right, so that's all within the liver, converts actually some of those amino acids, as well as some lactic acid, which you can get from exercising as well, into glucose. All right, we need glucose, we need sugar. All right, and lipolysis, so that's your breakdown of fats, and it helps to break down what are known as triglycerides within our fat tissue, and that's releasing the fatty acids into the blood, which again we can go forth, we can use that stuff for energy. All right, so when these guys impact metabolism, it's all about availability of energy substrates or things that may be needed. Now, resistance to stress is probably something you don't really think about that impacting your body in such a strong way. Well, you guys in college of all people should know that yes, stress is quite impactful. And now when you're looking at this though, what happens is these glucocorticoids, they provide a steady supply of glucose. Okay, and why they do that is for ATP production, because remember, ATP is like one of our main energy intermediates. It's really how we get a lot of our ATP, and it's all produced during a variety of times. Okay, exercise is technically a stress. Trauma, infection, emotional stress actually can lead to changes in supply of glucose and so forth, changes in supply of ATP. And how it helps with this is it actually increases the sensitivity for vasoconstrictors within the blood vessels to help maintain the blood pressure, especially during blood loss, and steady supply of glucose to control blood glucose sugar levels that can then help with production of ATP during any type of danger, or not danger, but trauma in a sense. Anti-inflammatory. Okay, so these guys are very similar to anti-inflammatory functions. Okay, so they can inhibit white blood cells. All right, so white blood cells are like your macrophages. All right, some of your T cells, some of your B cells, the guys that lead to the inflammation that you see during, infection that are red and swelling, that can help with inhibiting those that are involved in the inflammation. All right, so they can actually help reduce that swelling and pain and redness that you see, all by inhibiting the white blood cells within the inflammation that can impact, the blood flow to whatever, trauma you have from an infection, which will then lead to that reduction of the redness that you see. Okay, and this kind of falls hand in hand with immune suppression. Okay, so high levels of this actually suppress immune responses. Now, this is good and bad. Okay, so sometimes we do want immune responses, and sometimes immune suppression can really impact how treatments occur. So, like everything, these guys also need to be balanced. And because of that factor, these types of glucocorticoids, they're used clinically. All right, our autoimmune disorders, or rheumatoid arthritis, we use a lot of these to kind of control the inflammation, preventing organ transplant rejection. We kind of suppress the immune system of the receiver from attacking the newly implanted organ. Okay, so these not only within your body, they're doing, a lot of times you take them in a pill form to help with a lot of your pain. Now, like I said, obviously this all needs to be controlled. Okay, so this is controlled by what is known as the HPA axis. Okay, that's hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And again, it's a negative feedback system. Okay, so hence its name, the HPA. It's the hypothalamus, anterior, and adrenal cortex. All right, so what happens during these axis and the control? Low blood cortisol levels stimulate the hypothalamus. Okay, and it releases this CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone. And CRH travels through that system we discussed last lecture to the anterior pituitary, and that stimulates the secretion of ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. ACTH enters the bloodstream, same as we had discussed, down the veins, and targets the adrenal cortex. All right, and then when it targets it and it binds the target cell, it stimulates the release of glucocorticoids. Now, this, again, primary cortisol, right? About 95% of it. And the rising cortisol levels will eventually act as its negative feedback, and it goes back and inhibits the releasing hormones of the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Okay, as again, it's once to prevent excessive hormone. Now, ACTH, or the adrenocorticotropic hormone, can weakly stimulate aldosterone secretion, but it's not its primary role. When it comes to cortisol, it's mostly its primary role. Again, just a depiction, right? Stimulus. We got our low glucocorticoid level in blood. Okay. We get the signal to the hypothalamus, neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus fire, they increase the CRH, and they then lead their way down to the anterior pituitary, which then will lead to secretion of ACTH. ACTH finds its way into the cortex, and then it leads to a secretion of the glucocorticoids. Once that corticoid level in blood is at the point where it's functioning fine and no longer needs this hormonal response, it leads to a feedback inhibiting these two. Okay, next zone. All right, this is your androgens. All right, zona reticularis. This is your androgens. Now, most commonly, the hormone is DHEA. All right, so that's just a weak androgen. Now, its role is pretty big with development, puberty side of things. It's actually really minor in males. Okay, males, it's mostly testosterone dominant with a lot of stuff. Very minimal effects DHEA does, but it's really important in females. So this is actually the precursor for estrogen. So it goes through a processing method where it actually becomes estrogen, and as such, estrogen leads to many of the functions down the line for menstruation cycle, as well as it becomes a source of estrogen after menopause, and it can also impact the libido. Okay, now this also contributes to all the extra physical features you see after you've gone through puberty. All right, so pubic and axillary hair, your growth spurt, and then this time that is in both sexes. Okay, so each of them have their own little thing, okay, but this is all both sexes. The pubic axillary hair and the growth spurts come from this. And again, controlled. This time it's primarily controlled by the ACTH hormone. Just a quick, show of this. Okay, suprarenal gland. We're looking down in here. As you can see, the three different regions, right? We got your mineralocorticoids, glomerulus. Your glucocorticoids has the most. Okay, they're androgens, and then we'll get to these guys. Okay. And you can kind of see this is coming off the location of the suprarenal gland and get a little better view of its association with the kidney. Okay, so that last one, the medulla, we saw on the bottom of the photo there. This is more of, I guess you can say, a neural type interaction. It has modified ganglion cells. Okay, so specifically known as chromaffin cells, and what's basically modified about is it's got no axons. Right? Now the hormones that come from this is mostly epinephrine or norepinephrine, but epinephrine's the most. And when I said it was kind of getting into the nervous side of things, is its actual control is directed by the sympathetic nervous system. That's what controls the expression of the hormones or the non-expression of the hormones. And one of its main functions that you see on a daily basis, especially for watching a horror movie, is the fight or flight response. This is what gives you the run or fight. It has other things, okay? It's not just a fight or flight response, even though most of the factors that it does correlates with the fight or flight response. Heart rate, the ability to increase contractility of the heart, blood flow to the heart, your contraction of skeletal muscles, blood glucose and fatty acids. These are all things that it does, but also things that are associated with the fight or flight response. Now, the pancreas. This is a mixed gland. Okay, so it has exocrine and endocrine functions. And it's a flattened organ, if you've ever seen it. Okay, it's located in the curve of the duodenum, and it consists of a head, a body, and a tail. All right, I'm sure you guys have seen kind of a little image of this before. But now, when you're looking at this structure, exocrine is majority of it. It's like 99% of it. And it's composed of specific tissue and regions. Pancreatic actin. This secretes your digestive enzymes into ducts, which will eventually empty itself into the digestive tract and obviously helping you with digestion of whatever you are consuming. Now, the endocrine pancreas, much less, 1%, it's made up of pancreatic islets. These are highly vascularized, all right? So, and this is because that section is there to secrete hormones, and because of the vascularization, it allows it to secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream to have its hormonal response. Just the picture, right? We have our kidneys, all right, and now we see a connection of our pancreas. Okay, you can get a little zoom in here if you'd like to see it even more. We'll get to the, I guess you can see the highly vascularized system here, okay, and its closeness within the intestinal to allow its functions. As mentioned, okay, when it comes to more of hormonal secretion and doing its function, it's more of these islets that kind of do it. All right, and there's 4 main hormone secreting cells, and each one of them secretes its own hormone, okay, or its own class of hormones. Alpha cells, they will do your glucagon. Beta cells are the most common; those are your insulin. Okay, delta cells, they secrete somatostatin. Pancreatic polypeptide cells, or PP cells, they secrete your pancreatic polypeptides. Okay, so those are the 4 main cells that make up the islets. Now, the functions of these, they each have their own function. Okay, glucagon raises blood pressure. Insulin lowers blood pressure. I'm sure you know that. Comes to diabetics, we have insulin issues, can impact the blood glucose levels, which then further impacts, blood sugar, ATP. That's where you get your sleepiness or grogginess if you ever have low blood sugar. Those 2 are there to help that. Somatostatin, it inhibits release of insulin, okay, and glucagon, it's like a paracrine effect, okay, so that helps to slow your GI absorption, and unfortunately, this can lead to inhibition of growth hormones. Makes sense because we're impacting kind of sugar levels, which therefore are impacting our ATP levels to allow for secretion and production of other hormones. Pancreatic polypeptide, okay, it inhibits somatostatin secretion. Okay, this helps you with gallbladder contraction. Pancreatic enzyme secretion, which furthermore then helps with secretion into the GI tract to allow you to consume the foods, or digest the foods, I should say. This is just, again, kind of how this looks, okay? Like I said, you have your alpha cells, all right? They are kind of around the islets. Okay, beta cells are more on the inside. Like I said, the majority of them are beta cells. Okay, those are your insulins. Delta cells, they are very kind of not so much a structured shape, kind of stretchy, different shapes. They could be flat, they could be blobby. Those are your somatostatins. And then your pancreatic polypeptide cells are more kind of cuboidal, very organized shapes that can be found on the outside of these islets. Okay. So as just mentioned, your blood glucose is important to regulate. All right. So, if you don't eat enough, blood sugar's low, you feel like crap, it's because you don't have enough there to make ATP to keep the homeostasis. So its regulation is done by negative feedback and involves both insulin and glucagon. Now, when blood glucose is low, this is your hypoglycemia, the alpha cells release their hormone, glucagon. And so what happens is it stimulates the liver, one, to break down the hormone and form glucose, okay, because glucose is low, so we want to make more, and then form glucose from amino acids and lactic acid, so gluconeogenesis. So its goal here, as you can tell, is it wants to make glucose because it's low, so it is finding 2 ways to make it. Then once this is made by those ways, the liver releases the glucose, goes into the blood. Finally, your glucose levels they're risen, they're back to normal, homeostasis is fine, and then the rising glucose level then goes back and it inhibits the release from the alpha cells. Again, just a quick picture. Blood glucose level, hypoglycemia, it's low. Okay, the pancreas then sees this. It stimulates the alpha cells, secretes the hormone, glucagon, and then hits into the liver cells, hepatocytes. Those then promote the formation of glucose, either by forming them by lactic acids, amino acids, breaking down glucagon, but all together it increases blood glucose levels, which then, once it's back to normal, goes back and inhibits the release of these hormones. All right, so to prevent it from going any further. Now, on the flip side, if blood glucose is too high or hyperglycemia, we switch it. Okay, so we're no longer looking at glucagon, we're looking at insulin. This time, beta cells release insulin. Insulin promotes, obviously, it wants to promote the use of glucose to get rid of it. So promotes it to be uptaked in cells for in the form, so it's breaking down glucose by glycogenesis, protein synthesis to occur because we can use sugars for the protein synthesis, fatty acid synthesis because again glucose can be used for that, and inhibition of any type of pathway that is leading to the formation of glucose. All right, because the whole goal is to level out the glucose within circulation. So eventually it would lead to a fall in glucose levels. And when it did lead to that fall, insulin went back, or glucose went back, and insulin is then inhibited from release. As you can see here, again, I have hyperglycemia. It's monitored by the pancreas. Once it's stimulated by that stimulus, the beta cell secretes insulin. It then goes, and its effect is on the body cells. And the body cells they basically do whatever possible to use or stop glucose formation to prevent it from getting into the blood levels. And then once the levels even out, we're back to homeostasis. It then inhibits this entire pathway. So, insulin secretion is stimulated by some other things. All right, so parasympathetic activity, amino acids, glucose-dependent insulin-tropic peptide from the small intestine, and the growth hormone and ACTH, which is indirectly via blood glucose. So it's not just stimulation by this complete drop in blood glucose sugar. It can also be from a response from these. Okay, so that can help with the secretion. Now, a lot of it is such things that are correlated with eventual glucose formation or breakdown that is needed for controlling these, but it's important to know that it's not just solely secretion is stimulated by the change in blood levels. Same with glucagon. Low blood glucose, obviously, but sympathetic nervous system activity like exercise can lead to the excretion, which makes sense because need sugars. Elevated blood amino acids when glucose is too low, okay, which makes sense because we need some sugar. So basically any process that these two would need to be there to prepare for any changes in homeostasis, changes in the balance can lead to a stimulation either directly or indirectly. And like almost anything, hormones interact. Okay, so they both can interact with one another and actually stimulate the other's release or inhibit the other's release. And just as I said, it's all dependent on what stimulus it's getting. Pineal gland. All right, this guy is quite small. All right, and it's attached to the roof of the third ventricle of the brain at the midline. All right, so you can see right here. It is part of the epithalamus. Okay, but so it's positioned between the superior cochlea and enclosed by a capsule derived from the pia mater. It's mostly got pienocytes and neuroglial cells, which you can kind of see in here. Okay, we'll have occasional astrocytes that are there, but its main hormone is melatonin, which again, this is probably people taking so many supplements that have melatonin in it, and it's because it all correlates with sleep. Okay, and it definitely does a lot more than that. It actually correlates with our circadian rhythm. All right, so this is actually an amine hormone, and it's derived from serotonin. And like I said, it's a key player in our circadian, or sometimes you probably heard it as biological clock. And it's controlled, again, by the hypothalamus, but it's a suprachiasmatic nucleus that controls it specifically. So its secretion follows a light-dark cycle. So that's just another terminology for circadian clock, basically, when we're asleep and when we're awake. So what happens is melatonin actually has low levels during daylight and high levels at night. This is why they tell you should take it when you're sleeping or want to sleep. And what occurs is darkness stimulates melatonin release via a specific pathway, and it actually comes into play with our senses. Okay, retina, you get our vision uptake, and this suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, of the hypothalamus, it becomes produced by the sympathetic neurons, which lead to the pineal gland, which then will lead to the release and production of the melatonin. Okay, and actually it's quite fast. Okay, and it's quite dramatic, and the levels rise actually 10 times or tenfold during sleep, right before waking. And like I said, it's there to promote your sleepiness. This is why they're like, if you're tired, drink this tea. It has melatonin in it. It's there to promote kind of the sleepiness, synchronizing your daily rhythms. And like I said, everybody tells you to take it. It's actually, you don't think of it as having this strong impact, but just taking it as a powder, as a pill, can actually help to reset your circadian rhythm. And a lot of people take it to, correct any things like changing of shift work, working night shift instead of day shift, having jet lag, things like that. And not only is it there to basically help with the changes between your light and dark cycle, which again have some things to come back to glucose and all the other pathways, but it can also help as an antioxidant. So it protects your cells from free radical damage, which can lead to DNA changes, destruction of cells, stuff like that. So the thymus is located behind the sternum, okay, between the lungs and the mediastinum. It is the most active during childhood, okay, during child and adolescence, and it gradually kind of reduces with age. Now, it has a couple hormones: thymosin, thymohumoral factor, thymic factor, and thymopotin. Its main function is to promote maturation differentiation of T lymphocytes, or T cells, your inflammatory cells that help with infections. It's also essential for the development of adaptive immunity. All right, this is why it's so important when you're in childhood. It's basically an immune response that is adaptive to exposure. So adaptive immunity. And it may contribute, it's like a little confusion here, not much known about it, but at least it looks like, but it may contribute to slowing aspects of the aging process. So those with certain amounts of this hormone, like more, okay, have aspects that are showing that it's actually slowing the aging process of either certain organs or within the cells themselves, so the tissue response. Now you see we're kind of getting in the last couple into more of like smaller endocrine tissues that are kind of an in-betweener and do several other things, okay, just like the gonads. All right, so I'm talking about gonads, I'm talking plural about ovaries and testes together. Okay, so these are obviously primary reproductive organs. All right, so they produce our gametes, they secrete sex hormones, but these sex hormones are essential for reproduction, maintenance of secondary sex characteristics, and When we're looking first at females gonads, so ovaries, now that I'll be talking about, these are paired oval organs, all right, and they're located in the pelvic cavity of the female, all right, one on each side of the uterus. Now, these secrete 4 hormones: estrogens, which I'm sure you know, progesterone, inhibin, and relaxin. Now, estrogens, okay, it's not just one, are primarily estradiol and estrone. Relaxin is interesting because when you're actually pregnant, the placenta becomes almost like another organ that releases hormones, and it's actually relaxin that the placenta releases. Okay, and so the functions are probably stuff you already are familiar with, you probably already know, but it's obviously there to help produce sex hormones, regulating any type of menstrual cycle, maintaining, of course, pregnancy, making sure that the pregnancy is getting the proper hormones and development for the uterus for implantation, preparing any mammary glands for lactation, promoting any type of secondary sex characteristics, so breast development, widening of the hips, as well as it actually helps with going back from changes in the breast development, such as lactation. All right, so some of these estrogens go back, okay, because as breastfeeding is occurring, the ducts are changing within the breast, they're expanding, and once you're done, they have to kind of go back to normal development. So they're there to actually help that as well. And relaxin, okay, as you can kind of guess from the placenta, okay, it's really key in pregnancy. And what it does is once labor is occurring, it actually helps to dilate the cervix, which kind of helps childbirth move along. Now, looking at the male gonads, so testes, these guys, paired oval glands located in the scrotum outside of the pelvic cavity, contrary to the females, which was internal. All right, and now these only have 2 hormones. All right, inhibin, which is named before, testosterone, which is actually primary androgen, but then inhibin, as you can see, is across the table on both gonads. Okay, and now its main function is to produce sperm or spermatogenesis. But testosterone does some other things, okay, but that aren't really, I guess you can say, related to strictly reproduction or preparation for reproduction. Things like allowing and stimulating the descent of testes before birth, or the pubertal development of men, facial body hair, voice deepening, increased muscle mass, those secondary sex characteristics changing. And interesting, inhibin actually inhibits FSH secretion. All right, so it's not just like spermatogenesis is a constant will, just keeps turning and turning and turning. It's actually regulated, and that's inhibin helps to regulate sperm production and to either intensely increase or decrease and so forth. So not all hormones are secreted by those classic endocrine glands. Many organs have those cells, okay? They release hormones to either regulate local or systemic physiology. All right, so they kind of fine-tune stuff. It's not so much dramatic changes. They're there to kind of help change the little things that the major system is impacting. And they may act as circulating hormones or as local hormones. Okay, or paracrines versus autocrines. Now, we previously covered these, so I'm not going really deep into it. You guys have already seen this. These are examples such as hypothalamus, pancreas, thymus, the ovaries and testes, actually some other tissues you may not think of. We talked about placenta, but the heart, adipose tissue, gastrointestinal tract, kidneys, there's certain secreting endocrine cells within these guys that help to secrete hormones in a response of certain things. Adipose tissue, it actually comes into play when you're doing a calorogenic effect and starting to burn off the fats. Obviously, kidneys we talked about, but all of these guys we've covered, but they are actually examples of endocrine glands that aren't really classic, and it's mostly just correlated with some endocrine cells that are there. Now, eicosanoids are local hormones. Okay, so these are kind of getting into some different hormones that those guys can also produce. Okay, and they're derived actually from an acid, arachidonic acid. All right, and it's a 20 carbon fatty acid in a cell membrane, so like a phospholipid. So there's major types, three major: prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and thromboxans. Okay, and they have some key characteristics. They're mostly by body cells. Red blood cells don't make these. Okay, they can act as both local or circulated hormones, and they are short-lived, rapidly inactivated. So they have a short response that's rapid. They can bind to plasma membrane receptors, so they're kind of similar, as you can see, to the water soluble. As such, these guys act via second messengers. Okay, so these guys, just remember, are water soluble, so they act by secondary messengers. Now, each, like I said, have their own actions. Okay, leukotrienes, they promote chemotaxis of white blood cells. They help to mediate inflammation by the chemotaxis of movement of the white blood cells, activation of the white blood cells, differentiation of the white blood cells. Prostaglandins, they regulate smooth muscle contraction, so it's your contraction, blood flow, platelet function. So if you're doing contraction, it makes sense because the blood flow is going to change. Affect reproductive processes, and they contribute to a lot of inflammatory features, such as having your fever, getting inflammation and swelling and pain that is associated with such fever and inflammation. Now, thromboxans, they cause vascular constriction. So these guys promote platelet aggregation. So they're really strongly associated with more of the vasoconstriction, regulation of blood pressure, regulation of blood volume. They help with, but again, remember, they are all water soluble. So all these functions are coming from secondary messengers. Growth factors, these are hormones that they are kind of similar to growth hormones, you can say. They stimulate cell growth, division, and tissue repair. So since they promote cell division, these are known as mitogenic factors. Right? So they promote mitosis, to have cell growth, to have repair, and all that fun stuff. Okay, they often will act locally. Now, they can act locally, but they can act locally as autocrines, so same cell, or paracrines, which are nearby cells, so locally on all fronts. All right. So as I mentioned, it helps with all the healing, repair after injury. It helps huge time when you're in your childhood and your adolescence going through growth. Promoting that cell division is key. It helps with muscle development. It's the tissue repair. Muscle growth is a lot of wear, tear, and repair. So growth factors, again, are key. So all of these guys, okay, they come together with what is known as the stress response or general adaptation syndrome. Okay, I'll call it stress response. We all know what stress is. We're going through it all right now, right? Any stimulus that disrupts homeostasis. So the stimulus now is referred to as a stressor. There's actually different types of stress. All right, there's the pull out your hair stress and the walk around frustrated stress. No, I'm just kidding. There's eustress, okay? That's beneficial stress that actually enhances your performance. So some of you that are athletes, you may have stress, but because of the stress, you go in and you play better in the game, so enhancing your performance. Distress is harmful stress that overwhelms homeostatic mechanisms, okay? So this is where, like, you were stressed out, you stayed up all night studying for the exam, and then you wake up and you are dehydrated or you're sick, okay? So harmful stress that overwhelms what should be homeostatic. Like I said, they can be physical, they can be psychological or physiological, but the body's response is all coordinated primarily by the hypothalamus to all of those. Okay, so the hypothalamus is the primary coordinator of this response. Now, when you think of stress and what we've talked about already, you probably think of the fight or flight response. All right, this is immediate and it is a short-term response. It is initiated by hypothalamic activation, so hypothalamus, and the activation occurs by the sympathetic nervous system. So like I said, it's an incorporation of the nervous system as well as these hormones. Okay, so specifically the adrenal. Okay, so it involves the adrenal. And so the sympathetic nervous system sends the hypothalamic activation by firing. The adrenal comes involved, and what happens is a rapid release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which then gives you your increased heart rate and blood pressure, your increased blood glucose, which is allowing you to get more ATP, the more oxygen into the body. Blood flow is actually redirected to your brain, your heart, and skeletal muscle. So that's your body has to plan how to escape. You need enough blood flow to spend it through your body, and you need to have your skeletal muscle prepared to react. Okay, and it inhibits those that aren't really going to help you in such response. So like your digestive, your urinary, reproductive functions, they decrease for an immediate and short time. So basically all your focus goes to this fight or flight response. You may not be knowing this, but your body's doing it with you. Okay, and this reduced renal blood flow is done by your renin-angiotensin aldosterone pathway activation. Okay, so aldosterone promotes sodium and water retention. Your blood volume and BP comes up. So this stress response brings in a lot of hormones, okay, that are in different systems, as well as a nervous system, sympathetic specifically, and just blood chemistry. Okay, so altogether, we know that this system, this response of fight or flight, is there to prepare us for an immediate physical action. Like I said, running from a bear, fighting it. Don't fight a bear. Now, when we're looking at this, we have the fight or flight, but we have what is known as resistance reaction. Okay, this is a long-term adaptation. So again, this is initiated by hypothalamic releasing of hormones. This time there's sustained hormone response, and it's actually via the anterior pituitary. All right, and there's key hormonal pathways. All right, the CRH, ACTH to cortisol, we've already seen that, talked about that one. GHRH to growth hormone, talked about that as well. TRH to TSH to thyroid hormones. These are all ones that are key that we've discussed already. Each one of them leading to some form of increase of energy intermediates, whether it be ATP, some increase of supplies such as glucose or amino acids, or metabolism of proteins and fatty acids. It's all there to maintain your energy supply and also to prepare for whatever tissue repair might need during prolonged stress. Like I said, you have prolonged stress, you can lead to some form of sickness or disease occurring. This can help to try to maintain energy supply and tissue repair associated with that. And lastly, we just got exhaustion. Okay, so part of that stress response, sometimes you just failure to adapt. Okay, so stress is so severe, it's so prolonged that your resources are depleted. This is when it actually becomes deadly and it becomes, against your health. Your muscles get wasted, your immune system is just not going well. You have an increased risk of disease and organ failure. This is why, a lot of times if you're studying for finals, you're gonna come down with some cold or some type of sickness or feel like crap. This is where that comes from. Okay, eventually you hit a point of exhaustion if it's carried out for too long. Okay, so looking at this stressor response, all right, what I said, what we talked about is it's got this sympathetic nervous system that can play into it. Okay, that's where you get your nerve impulses from. It goes into the hypothalamus. Okay, the stressors have a response in the hypothalamus. They can lead to a hormone release. And then that makes its way down to anterior pituitary, which then makes the specific hormone that as well as released ACTH, GH, and TSH. Each one of these threes go to a specific location. ACTH, suprarenal cortex. GH to the liver. TSH to the thyroid gland. And they all have a stress response correlated with what they produce. Thyroid hormones increase use of glucose to produce ATP. IGFs, lipolysis, glyconeogenesis. Cortisol, almost every single pathway associated with metabolism. Okay, whereas your general stress response is, besides this type of thing here, is more so your fight or flight. Okay, so your nerve impulses, your sympathetic system, your sympathetic nerves, visceral effects associated with epinephrine and norepinephrine release just gives you all that, increased heart rate, dilation of airways, your sweating, your contraction of muscles, everything that we've discussed in the fight or flight. Now, I've talked about the immune system like 6 times with the stress, so obviously they have some form of interaction. Now, immune cells, mostly macrophages, they release what are known as cytokines. Now, these cytokines can either be pro-inflammatory, so telling the body I need more inflammation, or anti-inflammatory, saying I don't need any more response for inflammation. Now, sometimes with the stress and immune response, these macrophages will release interleukin 1. So interleukin 1 actually goes forth and it stimulates the hypothalamus to release ACTH and produce cortisol. Cortisol, if you remember, it actually reduces inflammation, and it actually suppresses interleukin 1 release. So this acts as a negative feedback loop that actually prevents any type of extreme immune response, and it actually helps to explain why if you have prolonged stress, it weakens your immunity, because it's just continuing this steady kind of inhibition on this interleukin 1. So it's allowing basically the body to say, we don't have an immune response. We're not going to fight whatever infection we may be getting. So, just like the senses, we're going to talk a little bit on the development of the endocrine system. Okay, so unlike many of our body systems, the endocrine system actually develops in a dispersed manner. All right, and they arise, the endocrine glands, from 3 embryonic germ layers: ectoderm, mesoderm, and the endoderm. Now, development of the major endocrine glands, which we'll talk on, such as the pituitary gland, that starts about the 3rd week after fertilization. Okay, and it develops actually from 2 different ectodermal sources. All right, each generating kind of which posterior anterior we're going to get. Posterior, it arises from the neurophysial bud. So it's an outgrowth of the ectoderm from the hypothalamus, and it's connected to the hypothalamus by the infundibular stalk. Now, the anterior pituitary, it actually forms from invagination of the ectoderm from the roof of the mouth. So this is actually known as the hypophyseal pouch. This loses connection with the oral cavity during development, which then allows it to form into its kind of own structure, the pituitary. The thyroid gland comes forth next. All right, this one develops from the endoderm. It originates as a thyroid, okay, at a midventral outgrowth from the floor of the pharynx, and it migrates inferiorly to form its right lobe, its left lobe, and its isthmus. At the same time, the parathyroid glands start to form, which makes sense because they're kind of forming a little bit together. These, similar to the thyroid, are also endoderm. All right, and it develops from outgrowths of the 3rd pharyngeal pouches and the 4th pouch as well. Adrenal glands follow at the 5th week, and they have dual embryological organs. All right, the suprarenal cortex is derived from mesoderm. It's got the same embryonic region as the gonads. All steroid-secreting endocrine tissues arise from the mesoderm. All right, remember that. Now, the medulla is derived from the ectoderm, so we have different types of tissues here. All right, and they're specifically from neurocrest cells, and it explains its role as this modified sympathetic ganglion. So remember, these guys don't have the ganglions with axon terminals. Now, following is the pancreas. Now, pancreas actually starts to develop 5th to 7 weeks. There's kind of within that time frame, but it develops from the endoderm. It arises from 2 pancreatic buds from the foregut. All right, and the buds fuse to form a mature pancreas. And so this actually contains, if you remember, it's an exocrine and an endocrine tissue. So remember, these guys are basically 2 pancreatic buds. All right, one with exocrine, one with endocrine, and they eventually fuse together. So that's how we get the variation in the exocrine and endocrine tissue within them. Now, at that 5-week time point, the thymus also starts to develop, and this one again develops from the endoderm. And it originates from the third pharyngeal pouch, and it migrates into the mediastinum. After the thymus, the pineal gland starts to form. That's the 7th week, and it's derived from ectoderm. And it forms as an outgrowth between the thalamus and the colloquial, and it's associated with the diencephalon. So, that is the development. All right, there is a graph in your textbook, okay, or a figure, and it will probably kind of help you guys visualize exactly how that is forming, and kind of the way and time frame that it's going forth. Lastly, just want to cover some things that when the endocrine system goes wrong. Obviously, as we start to age, we have issues commonly with diseases. A lot of time it's diseases or diabetes or issues that are associated with a hormone concern. Okay, that's where a lot of hormone treatments come in. So it actually starts because your endocrine glands, sometimes they shrink. All right, and the key thing here is that it's not always. Okay, sometimes they will, but the real thing is that the functional decline, it's going to vary by gland. So it doesn't mean all the glands in your system are just going to start, shitting out. They might, your hypothalamus might go a little bit earlier, your parathyroid might go a little earlier, late. It all kind of varies by the gland, and it's random. And these common themes when we're going through aging is we have a reduced hormone secretion. All right, so that's where the hormonal therapy comes in. We have a reduced receptor sensitivity, so that again can be impacted by the hormone levels. We have an issue with regulation. We can't no longer have our negative feedback, so sometimes this is where later life diabetes comes into play. Okay, and these all contribute to a lot of issues that we, normally the older folks have, altered metabolism, your immune system is in a decline, your bones are weaker because the calcium is changing, your glucose is intolerance, like I said, later life diabetes. And like I said, a lot of gland specific changes occur. All right, so just a quick little, explanation of what might occur for each gland is pituitary. A lot of times it's seen the growth hormone decreases. We get muscle atrophy at this time. It's because you don't have a lot of protein synthesis occurring to kind of recover a lot of the amino acids. Bone mass starts to go down. It can impact the amount of calcium being absorbed. Your the thyroid hormones, if they go down, your metabolic rate is going to go down. Your body fat will increase because of the metabolic rate decreasing, and you have a risk of hypothyroidism, which is seen a lot in older people. Okay, now thyroid is one of a few that has an issue with the negative feedback being lost. Okay, so leads to the thyroid hormone levels being a lot older in adults, which we can't regulate it going off. All right, so it leads to issues. Now, parathyroid, again, parathyroid levels can be increased with age. Now, this is, yes, negative feedback, but sometimes it's just due actually to low calcium intake. And as a result, a lot of these hormone changes and the calcium changes, the calcitonin and the cholesterol, or the activated vitamin D, it decreases. So again, we start to see weak bones, brittle bones. You've probably heard of, as age goes, brittle bones occur. Adrenal glands, they can lead to an increased fibrous tissue, which also leads to lower cortisol levels or aldosterones. Right? Interestingly, actually epinephrine and norepinephrine can remain normal. It's commonly cortisol and aldosterone which really see the impact. Pancreas. This is why I mentioned that later life diabetes. There's slower insulin release. There's a decrease in the receptor sensitivity, which is correlated with the fact that the release of insulin is slower. And as a result, we get impaired glucose tolerance. The thymus, while, it changes over time, right, because it's large in infancy, it changes after puberty, mostly replaced by adipose tissue. As we age, it still produces new T cells, so there's not much of a dramatic change there. More so, it's an impact on the amount of T cells being produced, which will impact our immune system. Gonads. As we age, females' ovaries have reduced estrogen. Okay, this can lead to osteoporosis, an increase in cholesterol. It can also lead to one of the few where negative feedback is impacted because of other hormones being significantly increased. All right, and the same kind of occurs with testes, with the sexual hormone testosterone leading to a decrease. This all can kind of contribute to fertility often being lost as old age occurs. Okay, sperm quality starts to decline, and females, the lower estrogen levels and lower hormone levels impact with the ability for fertilization and embedding into the cervix, as well as labor issues. So as these glands change as we age, it can lead to some pretty dramatic changes within our body. And so I won't go into these. I just wanted to get, some chunks of what an endocrine disorder is. And you have hyposecretion. Okay, so sometimes if you ever have a diagnosis, it's hyposecretion of growth hormone. That means there's too little hormone. Hypersecretion of growth hormone, too much of a hormone. A common disorder is a target tissue may have the resistance, or it is because there is receptor or secondary messenger defects. So most common endocrine disorders will be one of those four. Now, just to touch on a few pituitary disorders, we have dwarfism, for instance, growth hormone. Kind of touched on this, I think, in a little bit at the beginning of the last lecture. Decreased growth hormone in childhood plays such a role in bone growth and tissue growth, can lead to dwarfism. And on the flip side, giantism, okay, because we have actually too much growth hormone before the closure. And interestingly, it can also lead to a variation of diabetes, and it's all more so a neurogenic or nephrogenic, depending on the responsiveness to ADH. Like I said, thyroid is probably what common people here think of when they say endocrine disorders or endocrine systems. There is a lot of thyroid disorders, okay, and a lot of it comes from exposure to certain autoimmune stimulations. Actually, a lot of more so physical side of things like diets, extreme weight loss, fatigue. Can lead to hypothyroidism or Graves' disease, things like that. But there is such diseases that are enlarged thyroids, okay, which can lead to the hypo and hyper the release of the hormones. Parathyroid disorders, all right. Again, calcium is important, right? We need that pretty regularly, okay, or else our bones are going to weaken. That's exactly what can happen in some of them. We can have hypoparathyroidism where we don't have a lot of calcium. We got muscle spasms, okay, because your muscles need calcium as a response to help with not only idle control but contractions. We have hyperparathyroidism where you get increase in fractures, weak bones, increase in kidney stones. Again, this is because it's not there to be able to control the calcium levels. Adrenal glands, you've probably heard of Cushing's disease. Okay, that's when cortisol is increased too much, and in the process you have muscle wasting, buffalo hump, structural changes physically, as well as issues with hyperglycemia. You can have Addison's disease. That actually comes with adrenal gland and both hormones being impacted. So cortisol and aldosterone being decreased. All right, this comes with like dehydration, hypotension. A lot of times these adrenal disorders come with more, you could say like physical changes on the body. And then there is an actual, this one I kind of put because it was just interesting. Is a type of tumor you can get on your adrenal gland. Okay, and actually what it does is it tricks your body into being in a prolonged fight or flight response. Okay, so it interacts with this sympathetic nervous system and the release of hormones where you're just in this constant fight or flight response. And of course, pancreatic, I won't go into too much. is the diabetes side of things. So type 1, you have your autoimmune destruction of beta cells, so lifelong insulin is going to be needed. Type 2, your insulin resistance, so that's more, inactivity, obesity. And of course, you're going to have too much insulin as well, so that's more of an insulin shock kind of thing. Okay, well, I know the endocrine system is a lot. If you guys have questions, let me know. Just remember, you have a quiz, and it's going to be due by midnight on this Friday. All right, so give yourself some time to do it. All right, don't wait till the last day. You never know if you're going to have Wi-Fi issues or browser issues. So it's better to catch it on early. All right, there's 5 days, enough time for you guys to kind of check that all out. So if you have questions, just come to me in my office hours or email. I'll try my best to help you guys. All right, see ya.